Once upon a time, in a faraway forest, there lived a small rabbit family. There was Mother Rabbit, Father Rabbit, and their adorable offspring named Fluffy. Fluffy got her name from her white and fluffy fur. One day, while Fluffy was playing in the forest, she stumbled upon a wild strawberry field. The strawberries looked so sweet and delicious that Fluffy couldn't resist and ate a few. However, the owner of the strawberries, Mrs. Hedgehog, was not pleased at all. Mrs. Hedgehog, in an angry tone, said to Fluffy, "These strawberries are mine. How dare you eat them without my permission?" Fluffy realized her mistake and apologized. But Mrs. Hedgehog was still very upset when Fluffy returned home. She told her family what had happened. Mother and Father Rabbit explained to Fluffy the importance of not touching other people's belongings without permission. Fluffy learned her lesson and never made the same mistake again. The next day, Fluffy went to Mrs. Hedgehog's house to apologize and presented her with fresh carrots, Mrs. Hedgehog's favorite treat. Mrs. Hedgehog was deeply touched by Fluffy's gesture and accepted her apologies, and so, Fluffy learned an important lesson. From that day on, Fluffy and Mrs. Hedgehog became the best of friends and embarked on many more adventures together in the forest. One day, Fluffy and Mrs. Hedgehog decided to seek a new adventure in the forest. They began to walk towards the deep forest and soon came across a large lake. In the middle of the lake, they spotted an island with a big tree on it. Fluffy and Mrs. Hedgehog pondered on how to get to the island. Eventually, they decided that Fluffy would carry Mrs. Hedgehog on her back and swim to the island. Fluffy swam with Mrs. Hedgehog on her back, and after a while, they finally reached the island. On the island, under the big tree, they found a treasure chest. When they opened it, they found a lot of gold and jewels inside. However, Fluffy and Mrs. Hedgehog left the treasure there because they didn't know who it belonged to. For them, the real treasure was the time they spent together and the adventures they had. So, even though they returned home empty-handed, they smiled as they walked back. And from that day on, they always sought more adventures together.